So thank you, Nicole. Thank you all for watching. Watching, I guess, is the right word rather than coming along to the talk. But and So I will talk to you today about archaeology along the far eastern Silk Roads, so Eurasia and Asia and Central Asia and those sorts of places where I carry out my own research. I think first I need to say a few things about me. I am the lecturer in Chinese archaeology in the Department of Archaeology here at the University of Aberdeen. And it's particularly nice to be talking to you folks today because the position I have was created by alumni donations. So through the Development Trust and an interest among alumni in Asia. So they were able to sort of really expand the remit of the department here and bring me in a couple years ago to work on Asian topics. I do Chinese stuff and I teach about China, but most of what I do is Eurasian stuff. So that's what you'll hear about today and so on. So it's really nice to be speaking to the alumni community. So thank you for making it possible for me to be here in a certain way. And thanks to the alumni organization, I think you're called something else though here, alumni engagement or whatever, for organizing the talk. So there's lots of pictures, lots of stuff like that, lots of stories about archaeology. So I hope you guys enjoy the talk. So when you think about Silk Roads, this is often the kind of image you see. You see a webwork of pathways across the southern part of Eurasia. So in this particular one is centered on India, but there are other ones centered on other places, but they all look very similar to this with a bunch of lines connecting basically every place of important note across southern Eurasia at that time. So the point to make to look at one of these things is when you think of the Silk Roads, it's often presented as a big sort of grand trunk road that goes across Eurasia all the way, and that people were sort of pounding from one end of it to the other with camels laden with goodies and that kind of thing. When we dig into it in some detail, what all versions tend to produce is something like this. So some kind of interconnected webwork of routes, overland routes or oversea routes in some cases between these places. And so that's one of the first things I want you to take from this is that there is no Silk Road, there is no highway across Eurasia. There's just a Eurasian world, which is driven by which is in many cases driven by economic forces, but also is a place of like any other place with people in it and towns and villages and life histories and biographies and all these things. It just happens to be involved in this global economic system in its day. And I'll talk a little bit about the chronology of this, but this kind of comes and goes over the past, say, 2,000 years or so. And there are different times when the Silk Road is really going and then it's not so much going and so on. So more on the chronology of what we're talking about is coming up. So I will say I've circled these in yellow circles. You see some of the regions we'll be talking about or I'll be talking about today. So we'll be talking about the site of Merv or the city of Merv over there in north of Iran today in the modern country of Turkmenistan, stopping for a moment in Turfan in the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang in China, and then following the yellow arrow off the upper right corner of this map out into the Eurasian steppes of Mongolia. So there'll be more maps, don't worry. It's an archaeology talk. There's lots of maps in archaeology talks. So in a lot of cases, you think of the Silk Road as kind of camel-filled deserts, difficult passes, desolate landscapes and so on, and there certainly is a lot of this. If you make your way across Central Asia, you'll encounter this kind of thing. But the important thing for us as archaeologists or as historians or cultural historians or anything is that between these passes there are great inhabited landscapes. There are lots of people, there are huge cities, as you'll see, and these sorts of things. So these are obstacles on the road, but these do not make up the road itself, right? So here's another map. This will be my guide map for most of the talk. This is a 17th century, slightly fantastical map of the Silk Road or of Asia with trade routes on it, let's say that. But luckily for us, in this case, the same three places that I mentioned, so the central Mongolian steppe, the Tarim Basin, and the area north of Iran are visible on this map, and I put the same circles around them. And the ordering the structuring order here is that I'm touching on places that I myself have done some work of various sorts. So mostly these days I work in Mongolia, but I have been involved in excavations at Merv in some time ago, and then done a little bit of work in or exploring in Xinjiang, looking at the archaeology there when it was still possible to do that kind of stuff. So there's a certain amount of personal reminiscence you're going to get in this talk, but mostly also these areas are good for seeing some of the things going on in the bigger Eurasian world of the kind of classic Silk Road. So to really establish my bona fides, this is the Silk Road, right? So you see in the picture they are highlighted with the orange thing. This is the Silk Road. This is actually an excavation that I supervised as a student in the ancient city of Merv. So in the early Islamic city of Merv. Somebody pointed out, not myself, of course, because I was really myopically focused on the buildings there, that the area I had cleared off at the side of my excavation is the main drag of 8th century Merv. So this is a classic Silk Road moment. That slightly lighter soil there is the Silk Road. This is meant to sort of as a joke. I'm not trying to say this is all that matters about it, but it's there. There is a thing, right? What I'm saying is there is a thing. Most of what you see in this excavation, of course, I was myopically focused on this building that you see there. It had a doorway, it had a hallway, it had a bathroom, whatever. It's the frontage of an iron manufacturing facility, which is what the back of the excavation trench is. So there is the Silk Road. It actually exists in a certain sense. But mostly when we think of Silk Road stuff, right, we think of your trans-Eurasian commerce, the silk of the Silk Road. But of course, there's a lot of other things. This is a great map put together by some of my Mongolian colleagues quite a while ago now, 9 years ago now, looking at the Xiongnu period. This is a period in the sort of 1st, 2nd century AD, which there's a lot of archaeology in Mongolia, and they made this wonderful 2-pager in a volume they produced showing the sources of all sorts of things that they had found within Mongolia. So you see here the reach of this economic system. So we have not only a whole selection of vessels and bronze work from East Asia, from China, fancy precious stones from Southeast Asia and Afghanistan, glassware from, it's shown as Rome on the map, but it's mostly from Byzantine Rome, so it would fit under that other thing there, and so on. But and then metalwork from the Pontic steppe. This is the sort of fanciest material right now in the Xiongnu world. These Pontic or Greek style metal decorations for horse harnesses, and then finally some little faience beads there, which are quite small. They're only the size of half a finger, but they've come all the way from Egypt. So they're manufactured in Egypt and traded across this vast trade system. And this is the early period of the Silk Road. This is the 1st or 2nd century AD, BC, where we're not going to spend most of our time. I've also added a stamp from Sweden celebrating that little Buddha there, which was found in a period slightly after this, or from a period slightly after this, in a trading town in Sweden. So we can see that is another small precious object that's made its way across Eurasia from India in that case, probably. So there is Eurasian commerce in a sense, and it's transporting many kinds of things. The other thing that we move along the Silk Road, of course, is ideas, right? So the Silk Road is an ideological system, moving all sorts of languages and ideas about all sorts of things across along it. My example here is Buddhism, right? So we see on the left the westernmost Buddhist monastery, which is in Merv also, from this period, and then on the right a selection of simple tea bowls manufactured in Southeast China, but really popular among during the florescence of Buddhism in Japan. So we're going all the way from Japan to Central Asia, carrying ideas along these trade systems and through these different cultures. So 2 things to remember: economy and ideas, right? This is what we're moving around, we're dealing with in Eurasia in this sense. So what's the roadmap for the rest of the talk? That was all kind of intro material, right? What's the roadmap for the rest of the talk? Here you see the sort of outline of 4 points. It's worth saying that most of what I'm going to talk to you today is sort of 7th to 11th or 7th to 10th century AD. So this is one of the great florescent periods of the Silk Road as a trade system moving across Eurasia. and so on. Ironically, of course, most of my own current research is about the period after this. So wedged in between the 10th century and the beginning of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. We have a whole bunch of other stuff going on in Eurasia, and that's what I've been focusing some of my research on recently. So that can be another talk. If you enjoy this, I can give you another one about that stuff. But right now, we're talking about this classic period of the Silk Road. So the sort of themes that I want you to carry forward as we talk about this, and these are maybe expected, maybe unexpected. One is a theme of visual exuberance, right? That a lot of the archaeology images are often kind of dusty. They're all the same color. You saw the Silk Road there in Merv, and so on. But when we get into the remaining textiles, when we look carefully at the remaining standing architecture, we see how visually complex this world was. It was colorful, it was brilliant, it was embroidered, it was filled with little devices and designs. Buildings are made of complex brickwork and stuff like this. So it's a really in-your-face kind of visual experience in this space. And if any of you saw the Scythian exhibit, was at the British Museum about 2 years ago, one of the nice surprising subtleties in that was the amount of preserved clothing and saddlery that they had. And you see that also there, although Scythians are much, much earlier than the period we're talking about. But there, where you had weird checkerboard designs and purple saddlecloths and all this kind of weird stuff. So it's a very visually exuberant world, even though it seems to be dusty a lot of the time. The other thing to think about is the cosmopolitanness of this. And I'll talk a little bit about these points in some detail. I think I've just talked about visual exuberance a little bit, but I'll talk about cosmopolitanism in some detail in a moment. And this isn't such a weird idea. The Silk Road is sort of one of these examples of a cosmopolitan world. But how do we, as modern archaeologists, think about this? More in a sec. So what's the journey going to be? The journey is going to be from the center of the Silk Road in Sogdia and Merv to via the Tarim Basin and out into the steppe, as I've said, where we'll look at the archaeology, the Uyghur Empire and Turkic Khaganates of that region. So very different than what you'd normally see, I think, in Silk Road archaeology. So if you're connoisseurs, I've got something new for you. So cosmopolitanism, and my formation of cosmopolitanism, I'm drawing a lot from the work of Dr. Kate Franklin at Birkbeck. And she was, I put her poster, she was here giving a talk last year. I put her poster up because she was one of the last actual human speakers we had come and visit us in archaeology in our talk series there before lockdown. So fond memories of the days when we had visitors. Not that I don't mind giving talks this way. So anyhow, so her concept of cosmopolitan is quite elaborate. She's just written a book about this, I think. But this idea of being in a place and also being of the world. And the nice thing about this is that it allows you to live in this world and both be one of these adventure traveler types, right? Another thing you think of when you think of this world of Eurasia is these kind of adventure travelers who are going back and forth, doing things and causing trouble on the way. But also if you think of dwelling in the Silk Road world, dwelling in this world as a way of being cosmopolitan, because essentially everything that matters in the world comes to your door. No matter where you are. So in the case of Dr. Franklin's work, it's in Armenia, or in the case of my work, it's in the steppes of Mongolia. That bigger world is coming to you, and it's coming to you through this whole economic system and in many different complex ways. So cosmopolitanism, that's the point there. So here's visual exuberance, where I should have told you the things that I told you at the beginning of visual exuberance, but you see some of a modern image from Xinjiang, and then an archaeological image of a textile excavation, some of the very dry environments out there. And you start to see some of the colors, some of the elaboration, visual designs and things that are everywhere. They're in all the images, they're on all the buildings. So it must have been a pretty wild place in a certain way. So we're going to stop, I said, at two places, Merv and Mongolia, same map again. So we're going to start out in the Persian side, the center of Central Asia, and this is a place that's often shorthanded as Sogdia in the old texts, in the old stories. And if you have a visual image of Sogdia in your mind, or this region in your mind, it's probably the huge blue tiled buildings of Samarkand. That's much later, that's Timurid, but Samarkand is the premier city of Sogdia in its day, right? The city we have now is not the same. It's just a big pile of dirt next door. You'll see a picture of something very similar in a moment. But it's also good to say that a lot of the images I've used in this talk come from an exhibit that was traveling around about 5 or 6 years ago of material from the Hermitage Museum in Moscow. So, since a lot of the Central Asia here used to be in the Soviet archaeological sphere, is now in the Russian archaeological sphere, much of the work is done by Soviet archaeologists. And as a non-Soviet person, a lot of this material, it was new to me when I saw this exhibit. I was like, wow, finally there's all of this stuff that I've either heard about or only seen little bad black and white pictures of or something. So I was very excited. And so this talk is filled with images poached from the catalog of that exhibit, basically. Lots of great stuff in there. Ceramics, paper, wall paintings, textiles, all that stuff was found in there. So Sogdia Margiana. So this is sort of a central node in the Eurasian exchange system. And if you want to have the standpoint of a Sogdian, the Eurasian exchange system that we call the Silk Roads, it's just the everyday economy of Sogdia. Like, what's so big about that? So I'll talk a little bit about architecture, because excavating Merv is mostly about architecture. It's not about bathrooms and iron workshops. You see some buildings here, images of buildings. And this is an important part of sort of keeping it 8th century in the sense that that piece of metalwork in the middle there, it's a bowl. It's an image of a building in a battle. But you see this kind of complexity I was talking about, this sort of visual exuberance of architecture. Lots of little shadow variations, lots of towers, lots of designs along the edge. The building on the lower right is a building in Bukhara. It's the oldest standing building in Bukhara, and it's made of elaborate brickwork. This is as I said, this is an area we really associate with tiles and blue tile work and that kind of stuff. Superb and elaborate, but later than this. And so in this period, we're looking at this kind of visual intensity created by an artistry with baked bricks. These folks are also tremendous military architects. So the thing in the upper left is a little fort, and then you see part of the walls of Merv in the background there. You'll see a bigger picture in a sec. Very, very complex. They're masters of mud brick architecture, masters of military architecture in some of these places. So our first city stop, our first site stop, we've already visited it, is Merv. And as I said, Merv is it's one of these nodes. It's a key node in the economic system of this region. It's now in this present-day country of Turkmenistan, but just north of the border of Iran, basically, just north of the border of Iran. And it's made up archaeologically and in modern history of several cities strung out right next to each other. So there's a modern city there, but some kilometers away from that, there's this massive, the massive remains of an early medieval city stretching up into our 7th, 8th century period. It's an early Islamic city, it's often described as. And this excavation I worked on here many years ago. They've shifted now. It's run by the UCL, so it's run by University of London, Institute of Archaeology, and they've shifted to working on the later medieval city, I think because it's more rewarding in a sense that you don't have to work with these humongous sites. Just look at the size of this thing. It looks like a landform. Everything you see there is built by people, right? Gigantic mud brick walls, a huge tell so big when you're on it, it's like you're in a desert. On the top of it, 20 meters deep, maybe more, who knows. Anyways, it's very challenging archaeologically, but you see the scale of these places, right? The small inset image in the center is the city of Balkh from Google Earth. It's a similar kind of city. And when I said early Samarkand looks like a pile of dirt, early Samarkand also looks like this. The city of Afrasiab looks like this. In a sense, it's a giant tell. It doesn't have the massive walls around it that Merv does. The other image to see here is that sort of dendritic greenish diagram in the lower right. All of these great Central Asian cities are built in what are called internal deltas. So the water's coming out of the nearby mountains, and it flows out into the arid lowlands, and it forms a braided system of rivers and streams that can be very easily managed for agriculture, for irrigation, and so on. So this is a pattern. I just wanted to show you this because you'll see it again in a moment. And we're thinking about human living in these areas, these very rich. When it's irrigated, it's extremely rich. It's filled with orchards and fruit trees and fields and all that kind of stuff. And archaeological surveys in Margiana have borne this out. So we know it's a very rich and verdant landscape. These days, this area at least is mostly just verdant with salt pan and bushes and stuff like that. But that's what happens when you don't maintain your irrigation systems. So another important place in Sogdia, and this is a place that's really been brought to light by this the study of material done excavated in the Soviet period, is the city of Panjikent, which is in northern Tajikistan. It's not amazingly amazing as a standing piece of architecture, but it has produced a tremendous amount of really, really spectacular wall, paintings, as you see, and then some of the spaces of Panjikent were burnt that were excavated, and so you get these. This is a wooden feature, both wood and ivory. It was elaborately carved. That gives us this insight again into this sort of exuberantly complex Central Asian world of the first millennium AD. So Sogdians are famous not just for building the thing that came before Samarkand, but, and as I said, all of this Eurasian exchange system could be considered the economic system of Sogdia in a certain way. And so they're very famous historically for their sort of trade and travel diaspora. So Sogdians went all over the Eurasian world doing different things, particularly to the east, right? So this is a series of images of mostly small ceramic statuettes, except for the one next to the tree there, which is a large stone statuette of what are called Sogdian images, right? And basically a Sogdian image for the most part is a person with a beard. These are from Korea and Tang China in this period. So 7th, 8th century from Shilla, Korea, and Tang China. You see money recovered from, again, from Afar-Siab, both Sogdian coins as well as Turkic coins and Byzantine coins. So these folks are plugged into the world and sending people out all over the place, like not sending as like a mission, but Sogdians who want to make their way in the world are heading out into the larger Eurasian world to do things. So one of the places, this will be our stop in the Tang. We're kind of out of order in space here, but one of the places where the Sogdian great impact or had a great presence is in, as I said, Tang and Shilla, China. And Tang is the superpower of Eurasia at this time. So Tang is a big Chinese empire centered in what is today China. But very interested in Central Asia and active militarily, diplomatically, and economically all around Eastern Asia. This camel, this is my main excuse for having this slide. This camel is from the University of Aberdeen Art Museums. So this is our linkage to Tang, China. In the what is today in the storage of Marshall College, what is today this thing, but it was on display a couple years ago in the library if you happen to be in Aberdeen and see that Asian show that was there. So we have a tiny bit of the Tang Empire here. So a lot of our Silk Roady material in Tang comes from some big excavations that were done in what is called the West Market of Chang'an. This is the modern city of Xi'an. In China, which is considered one of the sort of terminus points of this exchange system, the way that everything got out into the Tang world, and so that makes the West Market of Chang'an like ground zero for the Eastern Silk Road. Why I wanted to show you this picture was to show you what this sort of material is like. Like again, if you're sort of thinking of Asian trade, your Asian ceramics, you might be thinking of the really vibrant colors of the Song Dynasty or the blue and whites of the Yuan Dynasty. This is all before that. That's all coming. Right now, this Tang ceramic world is the world of greens and yellows, essentially. So you see this kind of material that comes out of those West Market excavations in terms of metalwork and in terms of ceramics and interesting clay technologies and stuff like that. So different, very different, a kind of different world than you might be thinking of when you're thinking of Asian and old in a certain sense. The Tang also, this period, some of these are from Korea, left us lots of images of people, which I always appreciate, to say here's all this diversity of humanity that's active in the Tang and Shilla world in Korea. We see the sort of the bearded Sogdian character there, but also the sort of basic little worker guy with the scraggly beard. We see weird soldiers and camels and Tang beauties and monks and officials and all kinds of things. And we have these nice imagery of all these people, which is really cool. And it complements all the sort of images we get from wall paintings and so on out in the dry areas of Central Asia. So we're going to stop for a moment in Turfan. So I said we're kind of jumping around in space. I probably should have put Turfan before the Tang, but seemed to flow nicely from there. Turfan is this kind of Silk Road's crossroads area. So it's places where I can do this on the next slide, where the environmental conditions kind of squeeze everybody together into what is today the Tarim Basin of Xinjiang, and the area to the north of it, the Jungar Basin. But we have here historically and archaeologically a whole string of communities around the edges of this very impressive looking desert. This is a Google Earth image, this is a space image, essentially. But I've circled all of the quote-unquote oasis trading cities of the Tarim Basin, and these are all internal deltaic cities like Merv. They're small, they're not Merv-sized. They're little tiny places compared to Merv and Balkh and Afrasiab, but they form a chain of points across the edges of this desert, which leads you over the mountains from Sogdia across the Tarim Basin, and eventually the sort of terminal city of this, or one of the near terminal cities of this, is the city of Turfan, which is in one of the lowest points on Earth, if not the lowest point on Earth. Anyways, I don't remember, very low. It's very deserty here when it's not irrigated, bottom line. You see some images of how deserty it can get. But to say this is a very place with great dry preservation, so we see this continuity of that world that you saw from Panjikent. Lots of wall paintings showing us different kinds of people, elite, monks, Buddhists again, right? And even a painter who's in the corner of a wall painting. And these come from tombs and cities and things like in temples and stuff that are buried in the deserts of Xinjiang. This is also an excuse to have my one picture of fabric in a talk about the Silk Road. So these are some shots from the old market of Kashgar, now destroyed, unfortunately, where you had a real sort of Central Asian market, vast Central Asian market, Kashgar being another one of these nexus points on this trans-Eurasian trade system, archaeologically, historically, and at least in the 20th century. Really was like that. So now we've hit a trip, you've taken a journey. I should say something, I'm going to go back for a sec, bad thing in a recorded talk, but I should say something about those little arrows there. One of the things about this constriction of this trade system is you can keep going east and you'll end up in the west market of Chang'an, and you can go north. And you'll end up in the Eurasian steppe. So the areas around Turfan and Hami, which is another city underneath the picture of the Grape Arbor, are real nexus points for trans-Eurasian exchange. So the place I'm going to focus on in terms of more archaeological material is in central Mongolia. So our first topic here is the Uyghur Empire. So a state of Turkic city-dwelling folks who lived in central Mongolia. These images on the right are coins of the Uyghur Empire, and I'll talk more about them in a minute. It's a very rare coin. That's the comment I want to make right now. So here we are on our map again, showing you where we have come to, north of China on this map, and out into this place called Tartaria Magna, the land of the Big Tartars. No, Big Tartarstan, this is what it would translate as. And the circle is actually centered on the city of Karakorum, which is the capital of the Mongol Empire. But we're looking at the urban environment before the Mongols built their capital, centuries before the Mongols built their capital. So here's another version of the Uyghur Empire. This is a Mongolian map, historical map, from a historical atlas of the extent of the Uyghur Empire, and the circle still sitting in the same place. You'll see what's in the middle of the circle in just a sec, but just to give you an idea of the extent of the political control of this state in the 8th and early 9th century, essentially all of what is Mongolia today for the most part. It's bits of Siberia, and it's a big chunks of North China, so in Inner Mongolia and down into North China there. So this is a major state. It's a great rival of the Tang Empire until that relationship is sealed with diplomacy, and they become friends. But it's a really nice Eurasian Silk Road state, essentially. Lots of stuff happens here. So the place that's most famous in the Uyghur world is the city of Kharbolgas, or Ordubalak in some older versions. Kharbolgas is what we call it now. And this is the capital of this early stage of the Uyghur Empire. And it was known, sort of known, mostly for the standing architecture you see in the middle of this sort of rammed earth walled thing with a big mound, a pagoda in the middle of it. But in the past, say 2 decades, a tremendous amount of work has been done here by the University of Bonn in Germany and the German Archaeological Institute in collaboration with the Mongolian Ministry of Culture and the Institute of Archaeology. That's a lot of people, but it takes a lot of work to work on these kind of regions. And they've worked both on the Mongol capital at Karakorum and on Kharbolgas here. So we've learned a lot of things that we didn't know before. primarily that this place is massive and huge, right? It's a giant city, as big as any other city in the world of the East Asian world at this time. So you see the sort of map in the middle, which is all those little lines and stuff. That enclosure you saw that I said was the central citadel is actually a tiny rectangle in the upper right corner of that map. All the rest of that stuff is low-lying architectural remains. It's been discovered mostly by LiDAR, flying LiDAR drones. So in total, this city is 7.5 by 2 kilometers, I think. So about 15 square kilometers or 16 square kilometers, which makes it equivalent in size to any of the great polity capitals of East Asia. So whether you're looking at Shilla, whether you're looking at Chang'an, whether you're looking at other big cities in Eurasia, like capitals of the Liao, stuff like this. So this is a massive metropolis in the middle of Mongolia, basically. And it's visited by an Abbasid, so a Middle Eastern official in the early 9th century, who describes it as surrounded by irrigation and fields and so on, and villages. And people had a hard time getting their head around this with good accounts, but there's no evidence for this until people started looking. And the weird sort of blobby diagram on the right is the city itself and its surrounding hinterland settlements. It's hinterland agricultural settlements. And these sorts of things. So we now know from archaeological survey, for the most part, that there were villages and there were fields and there were orchards and all kinds of things around Kharbolgas. And this is central Mongolia, so this is a challenging place to be a farmer. It's one of the best places in Mongolia today to be a farmer, but you can kind of see from that image that it's pretty much grassland here. We're right along the Orhan River, so there's not much water problem, but the soil isn't great and it gets really cold in the winter. But these guys lived here for 150 years. They made it work, right? With elaborate technology. And the material of this time owes a lot to the Sogdian world. So both in the way the cities are built and this elaborate irrigation and elaborate management that must have gone into the production of things here. So to continue our tour of the Uyghur world, this is another city site, Kermandenj, this is called, and it's in the Tulth River Valley. So it's near the modern city of Ulaanbaatar. But not that close to Ulaanbaatar, so maybe that was not the right thing to say. But I just want to stop for a moment on the satellite image. You can ignore the nice bastioned wall. That's a later medieval addition on the reuse of the city, but the Uyghur version of the city has the same two-part structure to it, the split city structure. You see the big empty space walled on the left of it. This is one of the mysteries of the study of urbanism in Eastern Eurasia. This is something my current research is involved with, is examining what's in these empty spaces. And trying to figure it out. There's a lot of ideas, like big tent camps, that kind of stuff. Ideas are in there, but nobody's actually looked. So we're looking at this and trying to figure it out. But again, you see the scale of this place. It's nowhere near the size of Kharbolgas, but it's at least close to a square kilometer or more in size. And we have a lot of places like this. More gratuitous Uyghur tourism. This is a really neat site called Purbajin. It's in the modern region of Tuva. And this is a palace that you see there's a kind of resonance in how this thing is built to the central, larger architectural part of Kharbolgas. This is out on a lake, in an island in a lake, so that's why it has the weird reflections all around it. Examined by Russian and European archaeologists, and being examined at this moment by these things, this little bat tile, mysterious bat tile from Purbajin. But this really shows you the extent and power of the Uyghur state. So now we're going to get into some nitty-gritty archaeology. This is some work that myself and my Mongolian and American and everybody colleagues have done to look at some of the tensions and issues that are happening in Turkic society. So the Uyghurs they don't appear out of nothing. They appear out of an already existing set of polities that come before them, that are living again in this large and complex world. So what you see here are little field notebook drawings of pottery. That's actually what this is, little broken pieces of pottery. And the point I want to make here is that we have a relationship of ceramic making skills and aesthetics between both the core and the hinterland. So some from Kharbolgas and some from a region way in northern Mongolia called Uyghur Gulf. And this is a contrast to the Mongol Empire, for example, which comes later, where you have an intensively elite urban style of aesthetics and living, and then you have a big vast different thing going on outside those urban cores. But in the Uyghur period, we have a close relationship between core and hinterland in many cases. Taking that one step farther, this is a burial excavation. So all of these are from the Aegean Gulf. So we see an inhumation of a human and their horse here. And this is a very traditional Turkic form of burial, dates to the Uyghur period. And this is happening alongside things like the penetration of a money economy into this region, right? And additional administration. So I like to cast this as a kind of tradition and change. So we have traditional people living in the countryside, and I'm doing this with a little bit of hindsight because I know what happened to the Uyghur Empire. We have people living in the countryside, living in a more traditional way, a more mobile way, and then we have this huge urban conglomerates administrating. Now, the nice thing about these coins that you see is that you'll notice they're fine spots and dates, and there were 4 of these coins, right? One found in Karakorum in the middle 20th century, 2 found in Harbolgas during some of the first seasons there, 1 found in Beshbalik, which is in Xinjiang. We picked up 2 of them off the ground in Aegean Gulf. So this is people walking across the land surface looking for things, and we found 2 coins, and we didn't have any idea what these were when we found it. We looked through all the coin books, and there was nothing in there. We had a joke that we were going to print it on a T-shirt with an email address and see if anybody could see it and knew what it was. But eventually we were able to figure out that these are Uyghur coins from the Uyghur Khaganate and increase the collection by 50% based in one river valley in northern Mongolia, which is supposed to be out on the periphery of the Uyghur world, but is clearly not on the periphery of the Uyghur world in a certain way. So what comes before the Uyghur Khaganates? I said something terrible happened to the Uyghur Empire. Well, nothing terrible happens to it. It just ends, right? Polities end. So I want to start to wrap up now by just talking a little bit about the Turkic Khaganates, and these are fascinatingly insular polities or 2 polities sequentially after each other. There's only 1 polity, but then there's a second polity after it. You see in the 6th to 8th century, and these are some archetypical Eurasian nomads. And here we see the head of a statue head of one of the great leaders of the Khaganates, a guy called Kultegan, who was the ruler of the second Khaganate, or one of the rulers of the second Khaganate, and had a great mortuary site, which included the head, which is no longer there. It's in the Institute of Archaeology. So the Turks, as I said, kind of are typical Central Asians in this case, or are typical Eurasians. This is just an assembly of Eurasian aesthetic, kind of played with a little bit. So the textile is from Dunhuang in Xinjiang, showing this very classic Eurasian images from Persian world. I just appeared and heard myself. We have some rock art evocative of this, these kind of belt plaque style. So this is what you might call animal style. And this stele on the right, you're about to see in more detail. So what are Eurasian nomads? I should have said that earlier. What are Eurasian nomads? When we say that, what we mean is people who, there are Eurasian nomads today. There are Eurasian nomads archaeologically and historically, going back about 2,000 plus, maybe 3,000 years. We're not sure yet, but we're getting there, working on that early material. But these are communities of people who get most of their subsistence from herding in Eurasian grassland. So you see a nice meal there made up of 5 dairy products, and a little bit of fried bread. So cheeses, yogurts, butters, etc. And live in mobile dwellings. So what you might know as yurts, or gers as they're called in Mongolia, and very good with horses, all those kinds of things. So Eurasian nomads are very different than our oasis dwelling people in Merv or in Xinjiang. But this is a world of mobile people. But we have Harbolgas in this world. So it's a world including all these different people. Anyways, introduction to Eurasian nomads. Sorry. I want to wrap up my Turks by saying some interesting things about these early Turks. The one thing is that you see, and what you see here is a close-up image of what's called Tanyaguk's stele. So in a couple of tomb groups in central Mongolia, they put up large standing stones covered in inscriptions, covered in writings. The Turks were, we would say, the first indigenous Eurasians to write about themselves in their own language. And I hope you can make out that image there on your view. We call them Turkic runic writing, right? It looks like runic writing. It's its own script, and so on. And there's, say, I don't know, 50 inscriptions in Turkic runes, which are, in these long ones, are filled with political advice and claims of history. The leaders are saying, I'm a great leader because I did these 10 and badass things, or political advice to future leaders. So that little quote there, "Oh, Turkish lords and people, hear this. How should I live? How should I be a successful Turk?" And these people do call themselves Turks. So these folks are very famous in the modern nation of Turkey for obvious reasons. So they put up these inscriptions, and we can learn about how they think you should live in this world. So here we see this is Gultegan's stele, and Gultegan's head again. So basically, if you sum up the advice of the Turkic rulers, it's not to settle down, not to trade, and to stay mobile and stay traditional. And if you think about it, these are the people who preceded the Uyghur Empire. So clearly some people didn't take their advice, settled down, traded, built great cities, but eventually also faded out, right? Eventually disappeared. The Uyghur Empire was overthrown by its own peripheries. So they tell us. But the sort of other lesson here is that Gultegan didn't write this, or the people writing after Gultegan didn't write this only in Turkic runes. They also wrote it in Chinese. So they themselves were living in that cosmopolitan world that I was talking about. Even if you're a herder in the far hills of central Mongolia, you know you're in a bigger world because you're in this bigger Eurasian Silk Road world. So now we're pretty much done. So we're going to say, remember visual exuberance and cosmopolitanism. There's whole ranges of new colors. There's whole ranges of new objects. There's whole ranges of new people that you haven't necessarily seen before, no matter where you are in this world. Right? And thank you very much for your attention. And I will be happy to entertain questions, which I have seen flying past me. So however you guys want to manage that.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Josh, for that. That was absolutely fascinating. We've got a couple of questions in already. So if anyone else has questions they want to ask, you just open the chat panel and it's the little speech bubble, and you can type your questions in there and I'll read them out. So we'll get started. The first question is, please could you give us an idea of the annual volume of trade along these routes? Was there a seasonality to the trade? What, if anything, reached the British Isles?
That's a tough question, which I don't have a good answer to. In very few regions along here do we have proper economic records. Like I say, the preservation is great in terms of archaeological preservation of things like paper and cloth, but no one has found trade records that I know of. So where we would say, today this arrived, and yesterday that arrived, and we bought this for that, those kind of things, which we do have in some other ancient worlds. I had a classmate in graduate school who studied the lawsuits of one of these little towns in Xinjiang because the paper was so well preserved that there was a vast amount of preserved writing. And once he learned how to read it, he could study all the lawsuits. But almost all the lawsuits in town were between people in the town. And they were basic, like, you broke my garden, your donkey is too loud. They were really petty, small town stuff, right? So it would have been a gold mine of trade information, but we don't have it. So this is a very good and general question, because almost everything that we think of as traveling along these exchange routes is a non-durable thing. It's cloth, it's foodstuffs, it's paints, it's I don't know what, books, papers, ideas. These are really hard to measure. So a lot of the images that I've shown you are what we have in the sense of things that preserve archaeologically. One thing that I didn't discuss is glass, for example. There's a big trade in glass. I say big, but going into East Asia. So again, in Ashila, in Heian, Japan, in all sorts of places all over modern China, you will find glass from the Byzantine and Middle Eastern world. So we can say they loved glass, it was everywhere, but in reality, it isn't everywhere. Like, I've walked a lot of ground in this area, and you only find that stuff in super elite contexts. So temples, palaces, tombs, that kind of stuff. So part of that question of volume, I think, is a question of how much of this stuff is having an everyday impact on people's lives in this area. So I think that the amount of silk shipped on the Silk Road, or the amount of glass or ceramics or whatever shipped on the Silk Road, is actually relatively low, just because how arduous it is to get stuff from one place to another. But there's a cultural impact in things like all those tiny objects you saw in Mongolia, those little faience beads. Like I'm pretty sure no Egyptian showed up in Mongolia and said, "Would you like some beads?" That they traveled their way along the system, and someone else came who might have been a Sogdian, who might have been a Turk, who might have been something else, with a bunch of an assortment of things. So the impact of small volumes may have had a large impact, is what I'm leading up to in terms of that cosmopolitan understanding of the world. So in short, no, I can't tell you the volume, but I can talk about it.
That's great, thank you. The next question is, are your Uyghurs connected with today's in Myanmar?
That's a complex question. So I will not go too far into modern politics, but no. So the Southeast Asian world, which includes Myanmar, is a different world. It also has part of this exchange system. It also has deep cultural and economic connections with East Asia, with Southeast Asia, with High Asia, Tibet, that kind of stuff. But the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, which might be actually what you're asking about, and the answer is absolutely yes. So I said that the Uyghur Empire of Mongolia fell, its own peripheries came and destroyed it as a city, as a central point. But by that point, there were many cultural connections between the Tarim Basin and the Jungar Basin, and the Uyghur states of central Mongolia. And when central Mongolia was lost, those populations, those elite populations for the most part, moved to what is today Xinjiang in China. So those people, they speak Turkic languages, and so on. They're not East Asians in that sense. They're Central Asians. So the city of Beshbalik, which I threw out there in a rush when I was talking about coinage, that's east of the modern city of Urumqi. Turfan obviously is in Xinjiang in the Turfan Basin. So Xinjiang archaeologically was a mix of Uyghurs, Turkic-speaking Uyghurs, other nomads like Kazakhs and Mongols. The wife of Genghis Khan comes from Xinjiang, for example, or might come from Xinjiang. People claim she comes from Xinjiang, but that could be a myth. Anyways, we also have Tibetans, very important in this period. And again, the Tibetans of this time, the Tibetan states of this time, are not at all how you might think of Tibetans today, with the image that they have presented as a whole battalions of monks. It was a very militarily powerful polity in the Tibetan plateau. So again, with a very big Eurasian affinity. So in the broadest sense, yes, but in the specific sense, no, is the answer to your question.
That's great, thank you. The next question is, how accessible or safe are the Silk Roads for today's visitors?
How accessible or safe? Pretty good. If you don't mind potential long trips, let's say. So if we look at the Silk Road as everywhere from Xi'an to Istanbul, Afghanistan, not good. Iran, challenging. The stans, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, safe for various different reasons. I want to sort of caveat this. I'm not offering you travel advice. What I'm saying, you can go to these places. There are tours. There are tours. You can go as an independent traveler. You're always going to be challenged in terms of strange and archaic and unfamiliar administrative systems and stuff like that. But in terms of, nothing is a war zone. Nothing is not North Korea. You'll be okay in that sense. And it is a spectacular place. I mean, I know of people, I guess people have told me that in recent years, in the past 2 or 3 years, they've been there before all this. They've been there to see stuff. And places like Samarkand are amazing to see. Mongolia is pretty amazing too. When I was working excavating at Merv, there was a Japanese tour company that ran a bus tour that would take people by bus across Central Asia, and they would come visit us every week. They had a bus every week. And since my excavation was closest to the real road, the bus would pull up and all the tourists would come out, and I'd give my little spiel, and then they'd translate it into Japanese, and they'd be very thankful and get back on their bus. This was some time ago, though, different time. But so it is possible to visit these places in different ways. You don't have to do it all by bus. You don't have to do it all overland. It's a long trip. I'll tell you that. But It's amazing in terms of landscape, in terms of archaeology, in terms of historical places, in terms of some of this material that you can't see anywhere else. And the food is pretty good. The food is pretty good. Sometimes, some places, not every place. Don't quote me on
that. Okay, our next question is, where would you recommend visiting to get a really good impression of the Silk Road?
Today, and it has to be safe. So, probably Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, that region, and Mongolia. You can also visit Western China. So, in my imaginary trip for you, it's Chang'an, it's the modern city of Xi'an, across Inner Mongolia to Mongolia. You're gonna have to fly across the Altai. You can't. There aren't really any good roads to Kazakhstan, and then Uzbekistan, ending in Samarkand. If you can go visit Merv, great.
Super, thank you. Colin is asking, what prompted your interest? Your interest in this part of the world archaeologically?
So I started in academic archaeology. I started in academic archaeology in the 1990s, the late 1990s, and this is when Central Asia was really just opening up, the first opening up in the post-Soviet period. So there have been Soviet, Russian, and Central Asian scholars there for generations, but in terms of becoming part of world archaeology. So UNESCO was very interested in it. At this time, they had a huge Silk Road initiative, and I used to work as a technical archaeologist. So I was like, oh, this is really neat. I want to go to this place. So I began there as a field worker, and then I became interested first actually in some of these medieval questions, some of these medieval identity questions. How is identity changing between urban and mobile? How does the economic system affect the identities of individuals? How do we see that expressed in this really multicultural region? That was my actual first interest in Eurasian archaeology. Then I took some time off, did some other stuff, and came back to working in Mongolia. And then I haven't stopped working in Mongolia since then. But I was originally trained as a Chinese archaeologist. So my original archaeological training is in a sort of proper East Asian, Korean, Chinese, Japanese archaeology. Where in the end I never have only done very little of my own research, but so it goes. You go to different places.
Thank you. If there's any more questions, guys, please feel free to put them in the chat. We've still got a bit of time left, but I'll ask a question while we're waiting. If you could pick any period in time to go back to and observe, what would you go back to?
This is all a tough question for archaeologists, right? Because you're like, if you had a time machine, what could you see? And of course, you want to say, I want to go someplace and that'll help me really understand something, right? That'll help me really understand something. But I always believe myself that the secret message is if you're trying to understand what people thought in the past, right? What people did in the past, why they did things, what was their life like? And we're looking at it archaeologically from great remove. And we're trying to interpret and figure it out from little remains and traces and stuff like that. There's all sorts of interesting stuff you find. But I also feel that, like, if I could transport myself back to a place that I've excavated, like what if I could go to that excavation in Merv and stand there on the street and look at that building I was working on and look at that iron factory behind it, I would get a better picture, but I might not get a better understanding. And that's the thing. The remove kind of helps us to understand. But I think in keeping with one of the earlier questions, like if I could do that, I would like to see those places in pre-modern peace, right? So places like Afghanistan, where I've never been able to go in my whole life, but people who did go before 1980 or whatever were like, oh, it was amazing like this. Or I had the luck of going to Kashgar when it still was a Central Asian city before it had been destroyed. And seeing that is amazing. That helps me as an archaeologist evoke the past in really interesting ways. And it'd probably be cool to see some of these places when they were actually standing. So to see what was Merv like when it was actually a city, or what was Mongolia like when in the Turkic period, like those sorts of things. But there's a lot to do. Time travel, difficult job.
Yeah, it's a tough question. Our next question is what and when are the earliest examples of trans-Eurasian trade?
Okay, the key word is trade, right? Let's say trans-Eurasian exchange. So trade suggests a kind of economy, and then we look at that trade as being maybe sort of Roman period and these sorts of things, where we know we have an economy, where we have money changing hands for goods. But essentially, in the story of human endeavor, as soon as humans could travel back and forth across the Eurasian continent, they did, right? So there's an amazing find from Moldova, so west of the Ukraine, that was made in the 19th century or something, of polished jade axes covered in gold foil and these cool bronze spears. And this is some of the earliest bronze gear made in Eurasia, which is the earliest bronze gear in the world. There are two examples of this material, one from Moldova and one from Xinjiang, and they're so similar. Like, you look at them next to each other and you're like, how are these not the same? When they are the same, but how are they not in the same set, right? So that is evidence right there, and that's 1800 BC or so. So that you have some kind of trans-Eurasian exchange as soon as you have the ability to do it, which is wagons, earliest horses, all this kinds of stuff. So people have been doing this forever, essentially. People have been doing this forever, as long as they were capable of it. Economically, as an economic system, maybe later.
That's great, thank you. The next question is, did any items from the Silk Road in your period end up in Britain?
This is an interesting and complex question. So we have very little. I'm very interested in what comes the other direction. Like many of my colleagues in archaeology, you've heard Gordon Noble, for example, speak, I think. He's interested in the 7th and 8th century in Scotland, right? We know, and we have things like that one little Buddha statue from Scandinavia. We have a lot of silver metal coming out from Eurasia in general in the Viking times and filtering in those areas. So it's possible that somewhere in some as yet undiscovered Viking hoard, for example, there's going to be Sogdian money or something like that, or Liao money or whatever that we haven't seen. But in many ways, archaeologically, it appears to be an interestingly one-sided trade, depending on how you look at it. But the big mystery right now, is people, right? People. There's a revolution in genetics in archaeology in general, and we're learning a lot about the interchange and movement of people and interrelationships of people in all different time periods. And that is starting to sort of eat into the ideas of insularity in a lot of regions of the world, that people will do what people will do, and they'll move around and they'll meet each other and they'll make new people, right? So we can imagine scenarios in which, even in the medieval period of Scotland or the early medieval period of Scotland, or even the Roman period of Britain, right? You will get people coming from Eurasia into the British Isles. We don't know anything detail yet. I can't tell you anything, this is true, this is what we know exactly, but I can certainly see it happening. What else can we say? All sorts of Asian things like fabrics and stuff, spices and so on, will end up here and be used in cuisines, be used in all sorts of things. So.
Great, thank you. Kevin is asking, what happened to Kashgar?
Now we're straying into modern politics. Many of these old cities of Xinjiang have been completely remodeled by the modern Chinese state. So the old mud brick cities, or the old mud brick and stone cities, have been completely destroyed and rebuilt in a modern Chinese way. I had this strange experience the last time I was in Xinjiang, which was many years ago now. And I was in a taxi, and someone else in the taxi, several people were in the taxi, and was saying, "Oh, where are you from?" These kinds of things. And I'm in Urumqi, which is a modern Chinese provincial capital at this point. And everybody in the taxi said, "You should have been here before this was all built, right? When this wasn't a modern Chinese city, when this was an old city." And Urumqi's always been a modern city. But it had changed that quickly. I had been there in the 1990s as a backpacker, and I had seen all these places. But now all these cities have been remodeled completely or sort of recreated. There's a phrase that I can't remember properly in Chinese right now, which is basically making a new old thing, where you take an idea of what the past was and you rebuild it in a modern way with easy delivery paths and electricity and that sort of stuff, but it still kind of looks old. So created as a tourist site, essentially. So the story of Xinjiang, as I said, is very terrible and very politically sensitive right now.
Great, thank you.
Look in the news media, you'll find it. Pardon?
Apologies for any pronunciation that might be wrong here, but the next question is, would the descendants of Çatalhöyük have been involved in the Silk Road?
You did great.
Did I?
Çatalhöyük is a very hard name to pronounce. The descendants of Çatalhöyük. So Çatalhöyük is a Neolithic community in central Turkey, or central Anatolia, what is today Turkey. And in a sense, yes, because they're there, right? So they're going to be descendants of the people who lived in Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, and by the 2nd century AD, so 6,000 years after Çatalhöyük, there is exchange across Eurasia. So there is a set of ideas about language that were generated in the late 1980s, 1990s, about how some of the languages of Central Asia came to be, and early agriculturalists in Anatolia are involved in that story. So that may be sort of the question you're thinking about. But really we're in two different worlds. We're in two very different worlds. Eurasia has its own Neolithic world. So Çatalhöyük is a Neolithic settlement. Eurasia has its own Neolithic world, which is itself also very interesting and wrapped up in these ideas of how does pastoralism work and how do village societies work and so on. So if you remember, Merv is part of the Persian world, I said sort of offhandedly at the beginning. And the world of Middle Eastern agriculture, Middle Eastern settlement, Middle Eastern polities goes way up into Central Asia. So Merv, the city of Merv, is founded, or we think founded by people coming from the Middle Eastern world. So it's a city in the Middle Eastern world before it's a city in the Central Asian world. And that goes all the way across. This is one of the great mysteries of Central Asian and Eurasian archaeology, is the borderline between the very early Southwestern Asian world and Central Asian or Eastern world has not yet been found. Like, we just haven't yet found, but it's made its way to Uzbekistan. So we're in Uzbekistan, and we're in what's called the Heshi corridor, which is the western side of Xinjiang. And that's where we have stuff of contemporary period, very different. But when does that connection get made in terms of talking about early farmers? It's a growth field in archaeology.
Thank you so much. I think that was our last question. We do still have a few minutes if anyone's got any last minute burning questions they have to get off their chest. And we'll give you a couple of minutes to put that in the chat there.
I can also give you travel advice. I will do that. I'm now more relaxed about it.
Perfect. Well, I think it's safe to say when the world goes back to normal, I want you on my pub quiz team.
I'm only good at this very narrow topic, I'll tell you that. And how many pub quizzes are about the history of Eurasia?
Oh, but there's always questions that come up that you think no one knows that, but I'm quite confident you would know that. Okay, I think we'll just wrap up then if there's no other questions coming in at the moment. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Josh, that was absolutely fascinating, like I said before, and I certainly did catch your offer to come back another time. We will certainly be calling on you again. that was not
willing, you know. Thank you for organizing, and thank everybody for coming and listening to the talk here. And I'm happy to come back.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Thank you to everyone for coming to join us this afternoon. It was great to see so many of you. I think we had 117 at the highest point, so a lot of us joined in today. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Josh, and hope everyone has a lovely evening.